Hi, I'm William Cook. This is my final presentation for the American Revolution class here at Liberty University. Talking about the American Revolution, what that was the American colonists' fight towards independence and breaking off from Great British rule and becoming their own independent nation. And what I'm going to be looking at today was the Christian aspect. Specifically, how did the leaders use Christianity to inspire soldiers and colonists? And we're going to be looking at that from several different levels. Start from the top. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, the leaders of how they used a Christian stance, biblical passages in order to motivate and inspire and justify this war. From there, we're going to look at the military aspect. We're going to focus on George Washington and how he used Christianity as a means of instilling discipline in his soldiers and keeping their spirits higher. And from there, we're going to look at a general that served right underneath George Washington by the name of Peter Muhlenberg, who was the fighting parson, as legend has it, a pastor that took up arms. And then we're going to look at several different chaplains that were in the Continental Army. Some served directly under George Washington, some presented sermons to the Continental Congress, but from all of these, we're going to draw how the leaders used Christianity to inspire soldiers and colonists. Was it successful? That's only measured in defeat and victory. So we're going to look at the aspects and the influence and how it impacted the soldiers and the timeline of the American Revolution. We're going to talk about the founding fathers here, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. And I picked these three because they were well documented in their Christian aspect in regards to motivating and trying to grab hold of the colonists' heart. They used Christianity because they knew that would strike home. And what they did was they compared the fight towards independence, the Americans breaking off from Great Britain, to the story of Exodus in the Bible. The story of Exodus was Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt and out from under the rule of Pharaoh. King George being Pharaoh and the American colonists being the Israelites. So they used this story to inspire people because they knew people knew the story and they knew they needed to justify the war somehow. Now, the importance of this to these three individuals was evident in a letter that John Adams had written home to Abigail, talking about what they wanted as the American seal. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin came up with the idea of the image of Moses parting the Red Sea, and then Thomas Jefferson wanted the quote, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." So right there, they're using Christianity as an aspect of influence and motivating the colonists and telling them we need this war. It is justified. We need to go and fight for our independence.
The seal represents what Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin proposed for the American seal, with images of Exodus in the middle and rebellion to tyrants as obedience to God on the outside. This letter here is direct from Thomas Jefferson to Benjamin Franklin, describing that that's what the American seal should be. We get clues of these meetings and their intentions through letters between Abigail Adams and John Adams. John Adams wrote to Abigail on May 17, 1776, commenting on a sermon that featured a parallel between the case of Israel and that of America. And the Great Britain has driven America to the last step, a complete separation from her, a total absolute independence, not only of her parliament, but of her crown. On 5 November 1775, there was a letter from Abigail to John Adams. Abigail was a key influence on John Adams, and she described to him that for a true patriot must be a religious man.
Now, George Washington was regarded as one of the greatest military leaders of American history. And I bring him up because it is important to show the success alongside the tools. So the tools being Christianity is what I'm arguing was the biggest influence. So how did George Washington use Christianity as an influence? Well, he was actually a front hand in fighting to keep chaplains in the military units. He thought that it was good for morale and discipline, and it kept the soldiers close to God. And while they were going through great distress, it was important to take care of their souls. Now, he had several letters back and forth to Congress fighting to get one chaplain per unit. Now, Congress didn't want to do that. They were only paying them the rank of a colonel in the first place. And to put one in every unit, they did not want to do. They tried to get one in every brigade, but George Washington was adamant on how that this was not effective. In his general orders, he is actually ordering his soldiers who are not standing post to be attending Sunday service because it is important to maintain the discipline and it is important to keep their morale high. At the Battle of Valley Forge, George Washington actually handed out Thomas Paine's Common Sense to every soldier, which in the pamphlet makes several ties to Christianity. He uses these aspects as motivation for his soldiers. Discipline is certainly one of the things that George Washington's military was remembered for. And in his own words, in his own letters, he talks about the chaplains and maintaining that relationship, that spiritual aspect being essential to maintaining discipline in the soldiers.
George Washington was referred to by the American leaders as America's Moses, and that he was the leader in the fight towards the fight of independence. And George Washington held the role of a chaplain very highly in the military, as he wrote several times to the Continental Congress in order to have one minister per unit. And as of May 1777, he accomplished this by the Continental Congress commissioning chaplains to the Continental Army and getting the pay of that of a colonel. Dr. Thomas S. Kidd summarizes George Washington as, to patriots generals like George Washington, the chaplain's work was absolutely essential for sustaining the enormous sacrifices required of the soldiers and for assuring them that God was on their side. George Washington affirms this in his general orders written to the troops, giving them one night of whoever was not on post, requiring his soldiers to be attending the Sunday sermons. Further in the war, George Washington had gone through several different chaplains that had drawn close to him. One of these chaplains in particular being Israel Evans. And George Washington publicly stated that it was men like Evans who cultivated divine assistance and helped them win the war. The evidence is clear through General Washington's general orders and letters to Congress that the role of the chaplain was essential to the victory of the Americans during the American Revolution.
The Fighting Parson, Peter Muhlenberg. Now, this was a Lutheran pastor in Virginia. Now, the famous story is when the war had started, he decided to join the military, and he was appointed to the Virginia's 8th Regiment. Now, before this was announced, he had a Sunday service of which he famously approached his congregation, stood up there, and started giving a sermon on Ecclesiastes about how there was a time for everything, a time for mourning, a time for prayer. And then in his sermon, he said, there is a time for prayer and a time for war. The time for war has now come. And at that point, he removed his minister's robe and unveiled himself to be in a military attire. Now, Peter Muhlenberg this day joined the military in front of his congregation, and that day 300 Virginians signed up to be under his under his command. Now, Peter Muhlenberg, right there immediately, was able to inspire through Christianity, and there's nothing stronger than the heart of a volunteer. So Peter Muhlenberg was then directly under George Washington. Now, his unit had proven to be disciplined, have high honor, high morale, and they were involved in several battles that were involved in the American Revolution. such as Germantown, Valley Forge, and the Siege of Yorktown, which is what successfully had ended the war. Peter Muhlenberg was able to lead his men, maintain discipline, and it was quoted by George Washington as being essential, and George Washington quoted his men's discipline.
As I know it will give you pleasure, I shall just tell you that there was never more harmony subsided in any corps than in mine at present. This was a quote by Peter Muhlenberg written to his peers prior to the siege of Yorktown, one of the many battles that George Washington had personally entrusted Muhlenberg with taking up the defense of the artillery during the fight. George Washington also appointed Peter Muhlenberg's unit to march towards Philadelphia first. That was specifically for the discipline and wanting to make a good first impression on a new city. There are many different counts and many different encounters with Peter Muhlenberg, but one that stands out is a journal by the soldier by the name of James Thatcher. Now, James Thatcher had served under Peter Muhlenberg briefly and was told the story of how he became the fighting parson and described Peter Muhlenberg as doing honor to the military profession.
The importance of a Christian moral stance and value cannot be understated when it came to the American Revolution. And our leaders saw this as they used Christianity as a means of justifying the war. And from there, they instilled that into their leaders, the military leaders, George Washington's, the General Peter Muhlenberg's. And from there, they paved the way for chaplains to be directly involved in the Continental Army. Right there, that shows the importance that our leaders held Christianity to. Now, the chaplains were there to inspire, to maintain moral discipline, to pass out Bibles, to give Sunday sermons, and to help soldiers find Jesus, to help the lost souls find Jesus. And George Washington believed that this gave the Americans a decisive advantage and the call for divine intervention in helping them win the war. The value of a Christian stance cannot be undervalued. And our leaders used this. They saw this and they used Christian values via comparisons to biblical passages such as the story of Exodus, to putting chaplains inside the Continental Army, and they used this to help inspire their soldiers and were successful.
Several other chaplains played significance in the American Revolution, one of them being Reverend William Rogers, who was a Baptist pastor assigned to the Continental Army. And on July 4th in 1779, his unit was tasked with engaging with the Iroquois Indian, who had aligned with the British. His sermon prior had been noted to raise the morale of the troops, and he was quoted saying, "Politically as a nation we are exhorted to trust in the Lord. God hath hitherto blessed our arms and smiled on our infant rising states." They notably had a significant and decisive victory that day. John Witherspoon, the College of the New Jersey, offered a word of warning to the army, saying that the cause is sacred and the champions for it ought to be holy. This was significant because the British soldiers had been known by the Americans to be specifically lewd in nature, and they wanted to separate themselves from that image. This was not always easy. Ezekiel Smith, a reverend close to George Washington, wrote home to his wife saying, "Religion, alas how rare. True godliness, where is it?" This was a struggle also for Abiel Leonard, again, another chaplain that was notably close to George Washington. The struggle of profanity and maintaining the troops' morale taken its toll on the chaplain, and he had ultimately taken his own life. Now, the last chaplain that I would like to bring up is the chaplain of Israel Evans, who had written a prayer that was echoed throughout the military and printed in pamphlets and handed out to the soldiers. "Teach, I pray thee, my hands to war and my fingers to fight in the defense of America, and then the rights and liberties of it. Impress my mind a true sense of my duty and the obligation I am under to my country, and enable me to pay a due and ready respect and obedience to all my officers. Grant unto me courage, zeal, and resolution in the day of battle, that I may play the man for my people and the cities of my God, choosing rather to lay my life down than either through cowardice or desertion betray the glorious cause I am engaged in, And, O Lord, if it seem good in thy sight, shield and protect me, cover my head in the day of battle, and suffer not the arrows of death that may fly around me, or wound or destroy me. Enable me to flee all the voices of gaming, rioting, chambering, and wantonness, which have a destructive and fatal tendency. But as a stranger and pilgrim may I abstain from fleshly lusts with which war against the soul, and may I prove myself faithful follower of Jesus Christ, whom all the armies of heaven follow. Fight the good fight of faith, and have my present conflicts against the world, the flesh, and the devil crowned with victory and triumph.